I have just a small amount of perceiving objects and scenes left, and then we get to start talking about visual attention. As I stated at the end of the last PowerPoint slides, we're going to start talking about some of the regularities in the environment that help us to perceive objects, scenes, objects within scenes. And one of those regularities are physical regularities. And I'm going to repeat this for, I feel like, the umpteenth time. We have more vertical and horizontal lines than oblique lines. So there is this oblique effect of the reason we see that we respond better to vertical and horizontal lines, and we have more of the cortex responding to that, is because there are more in the environment. So that's a physical regularity. We also have this Gestalt principle of uniform connectedness, where if things are staying the same in these aspects like texture, contour, and color, even if it's partially occluded, we know that it continues, okay, behind those occlusions. And he gives us this example of these three guys with the jean. They're wearing jeans, and we can tell, right? The texture, the contour, and the color of those jeans are all the same. There's more to it than that, as these are men with legs. We assume this, but because that's all the same, even though they're being blocked by those railings, we perceive those jeans as continuing behind the railings. And it doesn't have to be something that is so clearly top down as well, that has this, like, well, I know how people work. It can be anything that has this, if it has the same texture, contour, and color, it's a physical regularity, that if it's kind of continuing on and it's being occluded by things, we're gonna perceive it as continuing behind those occlusions. I, of course, like doing these in class much more than on the PowerPoint, and that's because I can pull out and flip this upside down. But so one of our physical regularities is the light from above heuristic. The sun is above, and so when we're outside, the light comes from above, but also most of our lighting works that way. I mean, sometimes we have floor lighting, but it's pretty rare. So we have this heuristic that we interpret light as if it's coming from above. And so usually I ask the class, what do you see in this picture? And they comment on the kind of the crater, right? That it looks like a crater with a little mound in the middle. But all I've done now, so usually I pull out of the PowerPoint and physically go and flip that upside down, but you'll just have to trust me. And you can pull out of the PowerPoint if you go into the PowerPoints with the voiceover, you can go into the PowerPoints and go in and flip this upside down yourself to prove it to yourself if you don't believe me. But now now we're still interpreting the light as coming from above, and that changes our interpretation of the depth of this because of how the shadows are lying on this, and it looks more like a mound, like a large mound with a little crater in the middle. In addition to physical regularities in the environment, we also have semantic regularities. So something that is semantic is something that is meaningful, and so it's the regularities that are of meaning, right? So we have certain scenes that have certain objects that are associated with them. We have characteristics that are associated with certain functions that are going to happen within certain scenes. And one of the people who's looked at this is Andrew Hollingworth. And this study, this is one example of his stimuli, where what they did was, or what he did was, he had people look at either this picture of the gym, and those barbells in the center of those white circles were present. And so they looked through several pictures, and then later they're asked, and they're given the picture of the gym without the barbells and asked where were the barbells. And the white inner circle there, you can see where it says present, and it's pointing to that. People were within that line, or that, I think that was actually the average. So people were pretty close to correct. They were definitely staying around that mat. In that area where it makes sense, right? This is a semantic regularity that the barbells are going to be in this place where it makes sense to be working with free weights. And so another interesting condition is they sometimes showed this picture to participants, and the barbells were just absent. And then later they were shown the picture again, and they were asked, where would barbells go if they were in this picture? And you can see the absent, the white circle that's labeled absent, that they're actually really close to the people who saw the barbells and were trying to remember where exactly they were. Because again, this is where it makes sense. Now, this is where it semantically makes sense to have barbells. And that's the semantic regularity of gyms in this case. I've always really liked this study by Stephen Palmer from 1975, where he would show scenes like this, again, an example of the stimuli, this context scene that you can tell you're in a kitchen. And if they're looking over to the right, they either got the A, which looks like a loaf of bread, B, which looks like a mailbox, or C, which looks like some kind of drum. And you can see that A and B are similar in their appearance, and C is very different. Just so you know, different context scenes. So some other participant would get a context scene where the mailbox would make sense. Okay, so this was all really nicely counterbalanced. And what they found was then when they flashed these target objects, and I did not go look this up, but they did not flash them for very long. So they would show the scene, they would flash the target object, and then for A, for the bread, which fits into the scene, people were 80% correct. For the mailbox, which is similar but does not fit into the scene, they were 40% correct. And for the target object, they were also, for the snare drum or whatever kind of drum, they were also only 40% correct. I don't think that's a snare drum. Okay. But again, so if we're setting up the scene, then what semantically makes sense that fits into the scene, that is the easiest for people to perceive. And here, Oliva and Torralba, I told you they'd come back. I like this study particularly because it's called Multiple Personalities of a Blob. I just like that name. But they did a study where people would see the blob that is close to their names, and you can see this is the blob, and that blob is photoshopped into either the scene at B, and I usually ask students, what do you see there? And sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous. People say cup or he's holding something. Okay. If I ask for what is it in C, almost everybody says that looks like a shoe. How about D? I get sometimes the car on the left and the person, maybe a shadow of a person maybe on the right. Again, maybe a little ambiguous. But the point of all of this is this is the same exact blob that when we look at it by itself, it just looks like a blob. But once you put it into the context, we kind of interpret it with this semantic regularity, that it's going to be something that fits into whatever context we are looking at. So I have my very short summary slide of putting together perceiving objects and scenes. For me, when we have an exam in the middle of a chapter, it feels really chopped up, and it's never my intention, but we really started with the basics of object perception. I did the very bottom-up Biedermann's recognition by components theory, which is a very feature-like theory of that we have these features of the environment, but they're three-dimensional geons. And I think what's still more discussed in modern times is the Gestalt principles, that people are still doing research, and I left out some of that research because we were behind, but they're still doing research looking into how are we segregating figure from background? Are we interpreting the object first, or do we apply these heuristics first? And like I said, I think it's really interesting just how we do this differently, potentially, using these different heuristics. That is some of our ambiguity and the individual differences in object and scene perception. And then I started talking about segregating figure from ground and related that to and how we do that, but then relating that to some extent segregating object from scene as we want to get into this scene perception. We talked a little bit about getting the overall gist of a scene, that those global image features are going to help us with that. And then I talked a bit about regularities in the environment that also help us to perceive a scene and here perceive the objects in a scene more easily, more efficiently.